Who really runs the world? That is what Derrick Broze aims to uncover in his series, The Pyramids of Power. He says that the deep state is an overused term and oversimplified, usually leaving out the deepest of the deep state. Broze argues that the deep state has become this oversimplified catch-all, one that sort of leaves out the most entrenched and hidden forces. And he set out to map the real architecture of power in his series. A lot of times on X, we have these fights where we oversimplify things because as humans, that's a natural tendency, like, oh, it's the globalists, it's the Nazis, it's the Zionists. Those are convenient placeholders, easy to say, but too shallow to really explain who is truly subverting the will of the people. So Derrick Broze joins us today to tell us about the Pyramids of Power and episode 17, which is coming out right now, where he actually names names. Who is the deepest of the deep state? Derrick, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me back, Natalie. I appreciate it.
Okay, what did you think of that summary? What you aim to do is a lot like eating an elephant, is really who is it when we talk about that's what they want, that's what they're doing. So tell us about the overarching project and who is the Pyramids of Power?
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I started this project actually back in 2018. It was originally a live presentation I was giving during a tour I was doing, a speaking tour. And that ended up being a 3-hour presentation, and people were kind enough to sit through it. But afterwards, I thought maybe there's a better format to present this information. I've been researching these topics for going on 16 years now. And I find that sometimes when you're first waking up, as we like to say, you consume a lot of information. And I know I did, books, documentaries, podcasts, etc. And you start to kind of form your knowledge base of what you believe about the world, what's going on. Like you said, maybe you think it's the Zionists or the globalists or different pieces of this puzzle. And I wanted to revisit my original research, things that I maybe believed before, but with time have realized, okay, it's not as accurate as I thought it was. It's not as true as I might have believed. And to really answer this question, like, is there really a group of international organizations and people that are trying to manipulate our world? That was the goal of this series, which started out as 10 episodes and now has evolved to be 17 episodes. And we basically tried to look at each of the pieces of the puzzle. As today we're focusing on the final question of who's at the top, but the series really tries to kind of walk people into that process. So the first episode is big education, then establishment media, and then big tech. And it progressively gets deeper and deeper as we go through it. And I consider this to be a true crime documentary, not a conspiracy documentary, because everything that I report in the series is factual and can be sourced to the primary source documents, to government documents, and to firsthand knowledge. And when you really start to look at that information and you do so without hyperbole and without speculation, you realize that truth is really stranger than fiction. And there's so much that we can actually prove about this, to prove that there are interlocking groups and organizations and individuals which do have an agenda which is different from what they publicly claim. And so I've been working on this series now since 2020. We started releasing the first season. We released them in seasons of 4 episodes at a time, and people can watch the first 16 for free at thepyramidofpower.net. And yeah, now we're down to the final episode, the 17th episode, which I wrote in March and April, and it turned into originally a 4-hour documentary. I decided we need to trim it down, so we got it down to 2 hours and 45 minutes, and decided to release that in 2 volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1 is the one that you've now seen, the first part of the conclusion. And that's where, as you mentioned, we start to really look at, like, okay, we understand the institutions, big tech and the oil industry and all these different players that are a part of it, but who actually sits at the top? And throughout the series, familiar names come up like Rockefeller and Rothschild and, the World Economic Forum and Gates. Yeah, these familiar names, but I still don't think that those actually point to the true power behind it. So the goal of this final conclusion is, okay, now that we understand the infrastructure of this pyramid, who's sitting at the top or what is sitting at the top? And it's been really a deep dive. It took me about 2 months to write the entire conclusion. I do all the research, I do all the writing of the scripts, and then I do the audio narration, and I work with some really talented editors to make it really pop and visually appealing. And for the final conclusion, I've interviewed everybody from Volume 1 features Patrick Wood, who's one of the oldest researchers on technocracy. He's been talking about it since the 70s. Peter Dale Scott, who's actually the originator of the term deep state in the English language. He's the one who kind of brought it over from Turkish. And Richard Grove from Tragedy and Hope and Grand Theft World. He's a long-term researcher of the roundtable groups, which we also discuss in this chapter. And volume 2, which will be out in a couple of months, it features David Icke, James Corbett, Mark Passio, Larkin Rose, a lot of long-term researchers. And my goal with this was to not kind of come in with my own conclusions, because as I said, I'm revisiting a lot of my own research and my own conclusions and questioning them. And so I didn't come in with like, okay, I know I'm going to point at this group by the end of it. I was just like, let's look at all of these claims objectively. People say the deep state. What does that mean? People talk about the World Economic Forum and the Club of Rome and the Trilateral Commission. Let's look at the history of these organizations, the Bilderberg Group. And then in the end of volume 1, we do talk about this claim of the Committee of 300 is another popular claim, the roundtable groups. And then volume 2, it's going to get maybe a little more controversial, because I wanted to look at the most popular claims, which I'm sure you've seen out there on your travels on the internet, which is it's the Jews, or it's the Jesuits, or it's the Freemasons. And everybody's got their sort of pet group that they're certain it's them. And if you don't agree with them, then you must be a shill, you must be controlled opposition. I wanted to actually look at these claims and take them seriously. And here's what people believe, and here's what we can prove, and here's what's more speculative, and here's what we can disprove. And so, as you can imagine, that takes a lot of time and effort and digging and research, but I'm very proud of what we put together, and I'm excited to share this with everybody.
Well, what you're putting in front of those of us who disbelieve government narratives, you're putting a mirror up in front of us to show that we can't have these sort of lazy one-off groups to blame. And it makes sense that the predator class would not have really a shared identity. They seem to weave in and out. And I will say your documentary is very Western based. A lot of it is about Western society. So we can't say, oh, it's the Chinese who are subverting us, that kind of thing. So it shows us that it's never the right thing to scapegoat any one group, because it explains things in a nice way, because it doesn't fit together neatly and nicely.
That's definitely one thing that I think is an important point, is that the further I dug into these different theories and claims, I realized that in a lot of areas there is truth. There's elements of truth in, I'd say, each of these areas, from Jesuits influence to Jewish power, Zionist power, secret societies, etc. And then there's also a lot of leaps of logic, and there's a lot of assumptions, and then there's a lot of speculation that happens on the part of researchers on the internet. And my goal with this is, as I said, to make it more of a true crime series and to present the different characters. It is mostly, I would say, Western focused, not to say that other powers don't have influence. Obviously, the Chinese government is very powerful. But when you start to study the history of these movements and the Rockefellers and others, they're actually the ones who funded and helped the Chinese get as powerful as they are, through Henry Kissinger and through others. And so a lot of this comes back to these same power centers, which really go back to the United Kingdom, to Europe. And, in volume 1, which you've seen, we explore this idea of the roundtable groups, which is an idea that was put forward by Carroll Quigley, who was a professor at Georgetown University, and who was actually Bill Clinton's mentor. He's since deceased, but he wrote 2 books, one which was published after his death. The most famous one is called Tragedy and Hope. And it's this really epic tome, 1,000+ pages, where he was the first person to be granted access to the Council on Foreign Relations archives. And Council on Foreign Relations is another big Rockefeller-funded influential organization, which was founded in 1921. And they were spun off of a British group called the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And Carroll Quigley gained access to their archives and was able to, through their own works and through their own acknowledgments, prove that this group has been influencing world affairs for at least the last 150 years. And it was interesting because he didn't necessarily agree with or disagree with them. He thought they seemed to have reasonable goals. He was quoted as saying he just wished that they would be more public, that the public deserved to know that this group was operating in the shadows. And it's interesting that the way he described that is, he said that they would create an outward-facing group, so say the Council on Foreign Relations, which would have a public journal, as the Council on Foreign Relations does. It's called Foreign Affairs. But that group was actually just the outer ring representing the interests of another internal ring. And so you have this sort of series of round table groups, circles within circles within circles. And eventually we get a public facing group like the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Economic Forum. And we point at those people and say, hey, Klaus Schwab's a bad guy. He's doing all these things. But in reality, based on Carroll Quigley's research and his evidence, they're actually just representatives of deeper hidden power. And I think that's an important point for people to understand, that the faces we see, the names that we know, are probably not really the true power. They're just the representatives. And one other quick point, that by the end of his life, Carroll Quigley did actually come to believe that there was some danger. And during his life, he was actually upset that so-called conspiracy theorists were using his book to point to secret influence. And he said, they're just taking my words out of context. And he was famously kind of calling out conspiracy theorists, saying they don't understand what they're talking about. It's not as nefarious as they're making it seem. But by the end of his life, when his second book, which is called The Anglo-American Establishment, which was published after his death, in that book, he actually writes that anybody who cares about sovereignty should not let what happened in the UK happen in their country, which is to allow small groups of men secretly running things. And it seemed like by the end of his life, he realized the danger in this. And he did name them. He said that they called themselves the Society of the Elect. And then they had another group called the Society of the Helpers, which were sort of part of their infrastructure.
How organized do you think this is? That there are, so let's paint ourselves a picture that it's not Klaus Schwab or George Soros or Bill Gates, but it's someone behind them even. It's like an episode of 24. There's always a bad guy behind the bad guy behind the bad guy, right? And so these unnamed shadow figures, how organized are they if they are all over the world and in order to pull the strings? And
I think
maybe another question, what do they really want? What do they want the rest of us absolutely in their control so that they can what?
Great questions. As far as the first one, I think that there is levels of organization. Obviously, as I mentioned, the roundtable groups, the Bilderberg group, these type of meetings, these people are able to get together and sit down and have discussions. Does that mean they agree on everything all the time? I don't think so. I think that would be kind of just silly and sort of too simplistic to imagine that they're just on the same page, because this is a worldwide agenda. So you have people coming from different cultures, different languages, different backgrounds, and maybe even with their own kind of sub-agendas. But what I like to tell people is that at the end of the day, this power structure is going to align with each other over the people 99 times out of 100. They will choose, even if they have their own minor differences, they're going to come together to accomplish their bigger aims. And that's just how things tend to work. That doesn't mean that there might not be real true conflicts that happen behind the scenes. I tend to be very skeptical. Like, for example, when the news of the day is saying, Obama and Trump are having this argument, or Putin and Trump, or whatever. Yeah. I tend to think that some of that's just soap opera drama. Doesn't mean there can't be some real elements of it. But again, even if it is real or parts of it are real, that doesn't mean that they're going to all of a sudden turn against this infrastructure, which has put them in power. Because from what I can see, there's nobody who rises to the level of prime minister or president without having at least been approved to some degree of this. And in terms of what they want, I think that there is some level of power. Obviously, wealth is one thing, but these people, especially one of the other groups that I explore in volume 2 is what's known as the Venetian black nobility. This is another theory that a lot of people put forward, that actually at the top, the final roundtable group, if you will, is actually all the old houses that originate from Rome, from Venice, and which realized over time that if you're a king and a queen and you're very public, you eventually get beheaded or overthrown. But if you decide to kind of go to the background and you're just a celebrity royalty that nobody really pays much attention to and thinks you don't have power, you're more likely to stay in power. And there is some truth to that. When you study the land records of Europe, a lot of the actual land holdings go to these royal families, the king and queen of Netherlands, the royal houses that still exist and have existed for thousands of years. But these aren't the names that we know, Rothschild, Rockefeller, et cetera. These would be names that would probably be less familiar to most of us. So I do think that we're dealing with people who have an immense amount of wealth, and wealth is not the end goal for some of these folks. Maybe at the mid or lower levels, people are interested in money. I think it comes down to power. And then, of course, I do think that, as I talk about in the series, that there is a eugenicist agenda here. I do think that these people would like to reduce the population. I definitely think that that's one of the more kind of controversial final rabbit holes to go down, but I think there's an abundant evidence of that. And then I also mentioned that in the second volume, I interview people who have a wide range of opinions. So there's people who say it's the Jews, the Jesuits, the Masons, etc. But then there's others who say, like Mark Passio, he believes it's what he calls the dark Luciferians, that this is more of an occult kind of spiritual-ish agenda. David Icke says that, he talks about the reptilians, but even more than that, he told me he believes it's actually like a consciousness that can infect anybody and kind of takes over. And so there's others who have a little bit more esoteric beliefs about who is at the top and what is their real reason for doing so. And then I also interviewed people who have completely different answers, who don't think it's a person or an organization, but an ideology at the top, or different things like that. So I tend to think that these folks are eugenicists, and part of their goal, besides domination of the planet and the people, and goals like transhumanism, is to reduce human population.
Is it possible it's all of these things and that they are warring for power?
I definitely think that could be true. Obviously, it's hard for us to know. We don't have access to the inner workings of these different groups, and we don't know at what points they might be agreeing or disagreeing. I definitely think that's highly probable. And I think also it's likely that major world events that we see playing out in front of us on the screens are taking place for different reasons than we're told. Maybe it's some of this conflict that you mentioned there, like there's internal conflict behind the scenes, but then on the televisions and on social media, we're told a completely different reason for why certain events are happening, and that it might be due to these deeper conflicts that we're just not privy to.
Right. And so, this it overlaps with some of these are things I have not verified for myself, but I see these things played out in certain Instagram reels, I guess, things that speak to me, like this doesn't make sense. Could it be this? Celebrity cabals, humiliation rituals, where they have to show us what they're doing. So they do things in plain sight, and they're so, unbelievable that it's true. Sort of John Wick type, at the seat at the grand table type of thing. Do you put any stock into that?
I definitely do think that there is elements of that. And in chapter 16, I talk about religion and secret societies. And I think that is a component of how some secret societies operate. It's often known as revelation of the method, the idea that they have to reveal, whether for esoteric or spiritual reasons, that they have to kind of put it out in the open, and almost in a way to say, like, we're not hiding this. We're telling you exactly what we're doing. We're not, it's a sort of like the idea you have to invite the vampire into your house sort of thing. Well, they're putting it out in public. They're writing it in their books that nobody pays attention to. They're doing rituals, which I think most of us would believe that all the, the VMAs and all the award shows these days seem to be just open rituals. And I think in their mind, it's like, we're not hiding it. We're showing them exactly what we're doing, and the public's just too stupid to get it, or, they just don't understand it. So I definitely think there's some components of that the truth has to be put out there for one reason or another. And it could just be as simple as they're mocking us or laughing in our faces. You have to ask these questions when you see different Hollywood films that come out, which like are blatant propaganda. And, we've seen the increase in the last year or two and during COVID of movies talking about Contagion or movies talking about Civil War. It's like, this is also, I think these two ideas go hand in hand, revelation of the method as well as predictive programming, trying to seed these certain ideas and concepts into the minds of the masses in order for them to engineer the outcomes that they want.
Right. It's reminiscent of this movie that's really big right now, K-pop Demon Hunters, where the demons, like,
is that big in your house right now too?
You know it. Yes. Yeah. Unabashedly so. The demons are luring you in with their catchy song, and you don't know it, that they've taken your soul.
That's exactly what I thought when I saw that movie.
Like, literally. And I was like, why are they telling the truth about this? This is true. And I said to my girls, like, think of all of these bands that they're catchy, they're cute, but then they're doing these like demonic things in their performances. They're talking about sexual perversions. You're singing along to the songs, and it reminds me when I was 4, I was walking around the living room singing Like a Virgin, and my dad was like, come over here, Natalie. So it's showing us how they get you. Why do you think they let us have that message?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because that particular movie you're talking about has been really big, obviously everywhere around the world right now for
Yeah.
younger kids, and I picked up on that as well. It was like on one hand, I'm like, okay, is this a well-made movie that is subtly trying to tell us the truth, or is it another version of what we're
Yeah.
talking about here, kind of mocking us and like, hey, this is exactly what we do, and we're going to show it to you guys in a kids movie, and you're going to think it's entertaining, not making the connection to everyday reality. But I definitely had those thoughts cross my mind, and I don't know. I mean, in the Pyramid of Power, I do have an episode on Hollywood and the infiltration of Hollywood by the intelligence agencies, and I mean, I think it's clear there's abundant evidence that they seed movies, whether it's for pro-military agendas or other things like that. And I'm sure there's even deeper layers to that obviously we are not aware of. And we're not the first ones to talk about this. There's been people like Dave McGowan and others who've written books over the last couple of decades pointing to the influence of not just Hollywood, but the music industry. And of course, people have written and talked about the gangster rap industry and how that was specifically created to seed a message and to promote certain ideas. So I think we all understand the power of music. We understand the power of film as a medium and how these things can be. We kind of feel like I have similar stories of what you're describing, singing certain songs when you're younger, and looking back, you're like, well, I guess I made it through okay, but how did that shape my young life? I'm listening to all kinds of music when I was younger that was definitely not a positive message and was feeding into
Yeah.
some of the chaotic things I was feeling as a teenager. And I find myself wondering, did that come from the music, or did the music make it worse? Or which came first, like them feeding me these horrible messages or something like that? And I definitely think it's things we need to be skeptical of and careful with, especially with the young minds. The more we're aware that what we put in our bodies is important and in our minds. And in fact, to that point, Natalie, I just want to mention real quick that one of the most beautiful things out of producing this series, which has been a 5-year labor of love, and we're finally coming to the end of it. We're going to turn it into DVDs, USBs. I'm going to turn it into a companion book as well. But the coolest thing that has happened to me is that I've had about a dozen parents reach out to me and tell me that they've been using this to homeschool their kids. I actually was visiting family in Texas in May, and one of these students, who's an 18-year-old man, who's young man who's graduated now from homeschool, he heard that I lived in Texas, or that my family's from Texas, and then he invited me and myself and my partner. We got to go meet his family and attend his homeschool graduation, and they were very excited to connect. And his mom used the Pyramid of Power for his government curriculum. So
Wow.
there are things like
Yeah.
this that maybe can help the younger minds understand the world better, because I don't think I mentioned this, but the idea with the series too is that every episode is 30 minutes or less. And for the most part, I succeeded with that. There's a few of them that are a little bit longer, and obviously these conclusions are going to be longer. But the idea was 30 minutes or less, take the best research that already exists, take my original research, combine it together, end every episode with suggested solutions in every area. And then if you want to learn more, watch these documentaries, read these books. And the idea was that it could become something that could be bingeable for the Netflix generation. So now we have 16 episodes available. Somebody can start with one and get pulled in, hopefully. And by the end of that, their life might be changed, or at the very least, they're going to be a lot more skeptical of the world around them, and hopefully, have some critical thinking skills. So I'm proud to kind of have created something here that might help some younger generations with, amidst all the other crazy messages they're getting out there.
Yes. And I think if you're really looking behind the curtain of a lot of this, it can get quite dark. And you have to save yourself from that truth sometimes too. So even if the people behind a K-pop Demon Hunters maybe are malintentioned, if we are taking away the message, we must not be lured in by soda pop, then that's a good thing, right? So then we can sort of stop there for how we are in control of our lives without constantly, because you can dig yourself all the way dark, right? How do you live
Absolutely.
like that?
Yeah, and I think that's another big problem. And I want to just speak to that this series is definitely not intended to add to anybody's paranoia, chaos, or depression about the world. I wanted to make a documentary series that was the exact opposite of the kind of things that I was finding when I was first waking up. I give credit to Alex Jones, or what he used to be when he was making documentaries like Endgame and Police State. Those were some of the first things I found back in 2009, 2010. And they did help wake me up. But now rewatching them, I mean, they're filled with scary sounding music, and it kind of leaves you in a state of paranoia, as if everything bad is about to happen right that moment. And you don't really come
Yeah.
away feeling empowered, you kind of are sort of informed, but then again, there's a lot of speculation mixed in there. I wanted to do something that wasn't going to leave people like, oh my God, the world is over. Like everything's hopeless. We're screwed. I wanted to inform, to educate, but also hopefully empower by bringing in some ideas for solutions. And the final episode, I think, really is going to end on a strong note. Of course, we're going deep. We're looking at these different players, but it does end, I will say, without giving away the ending, a message of hope and a message of empowerment that I'm really excited to share with people. And I did want to mention that for your audience, if anybody wants to see Chapter 17 ahead of time, it is currently available on a streaming platform called Civil. That's CIVL.com. We partnered with them recently because, like you and Redacted and myself, their goal is they're not trying to be the next Netflix. What they're trying to do is create content and promote content that upgrades civilization and promotes individual liberty and conversations like this. So they have a bunch of original content, and they also host different content that you can find elsewhere. But they are now hosting Chapter 17 Volume 1 exclusively on their platform, as well as some behind the scenes stuff that I haven't released anywhere else, like a full extended interview with G. Edward Griffin and a few other things like that. So if anybody's interested in seeing the Pyramid of Power Volume 1, Chapter 17 Volume 1 before anybody else, you can go to civil.com/TCR. That's CIVL.com/TCR for my website, The Conscious Resistance. And if you sign up for an annual subscription, which is $50 and gives you access to all their stuff, you can use the code redacted20 and it'll give you 20% off the subscription. You can watch the series before anybody else. And I'm going to be doing some exclusive stuff with them as well, some talks, deep dives into the material. And as well, Volume 2 will be appearing there first in November before anywhere else. And if you can't afford that, that's fine as well. The series, the episode will be available on September 5th at thepyramidofpower.net, as well as all my other channels and things like that.
Yeah, it's really worth watching. So I'll end with this question. A lot of times, I don't know if you've heard this analogy before. I heard it first from Candace Owens, is you take the red pill and then you're mad at all the lies that you have debunked for yourself that you bought before. Then you take the black pill and you're pissed because you're like, everything's screwed. All the wrong people are in charge. And then you take a white pill and you have some kind of faith in a higher power that it's going to be okay. I think I'm probably somewhere in between black and white. I'm not sure what my white pill is because I feel like I'm constantly breaking down my own knowledge, which Socrates said is the key to wisdom, right? So sure. Where would you say is you are? And if you have a white pill, what's it made of? Is it a certain faith or something else?
Thank you for that question. I think that's important. Yeah, it's funny what you described there. I've heard this term recently, an apocalyptimist, somebody who knows that everything is going to crap, but
I'm gonna write that down.
but also knows that it'll turn out okay.
Apocalyptimist.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's when
I'm sorry, I was laughing so hard. I messed it up for you. Say it again.
You're fine. Yeah, so you reminded me of a term called apocalyptimist that I've become familiar with recently, and it kind of describes a person, which I think is maybe where you are at, and sometimes where I'm at, where you kind of see that the world is going to crap, but you also have an understanding or faith that things are going to turn out okay. And I feel like that's where I'm at. I'm definitely not black-pilled. I've been accused of being black-pilled quite a bit over the last year, especially around election time for pointing out things that some people didn't want to hear. But I don't consider myself black-pilled. I don't consider myself a doomer. Despite everything that I report on and everything in this series, I don't think that things are hopeless. And in fact, again, that's where the series kind of ends on that optimism. My white pill is recognizing that despite all the corruption that exists, not only in the US government, but in governments around the world, and I think government as an institution itself, despite that, I have faith in the people and you and me and just the average person, not in politicians, not in heroes or saviors that are put before us, but in the average person to recognize their innate sovereignty, to recognize that they are powerful, they are beautiful, and they are free, and that if we come together, we can make it through this. I definitely think there's going to be difficult, dark times ahead that will require, I think, a rethinking of our lifestyles and our decisions in order to stay free and to maintain privacy and liberty. But I do have faith, and part of that faith does come from my belief in a creator, that I believe that I'm on this planet right now, as well as yourself and everybody else hearing this, for a very important reason. And I know that the work I do every day is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. So I don't know how it all turns out, but I'm an apocalyptimist, and I know things are going to be okay.
All right. I love that. I feel like I need it on a sticker on my laptop. Please help me. I really appreciate it. I always love talking to you. Thank you for bringing this to share with us on Redacted. Again, you can follow Derrick on X if you want. It's Broze. My notes just disappeared. Broze Live. Is that what it is?
Broze Live Free.
No. Broze Live Free. Okay. Thank you. I hope we talk again. It's always my pleasure. I'm always cheering you on.
Thank you, Natalie.